Hello, thank you for being here. So today we'll be talking about my final project for data visualization. So this project will be a shooting of an analysis of mass shootings in the United States. So unfortunately, in the United States, mass shootings have been on the rise in recent years and have notably been a very hot topic issue. As a result, I decided to actually analyze the data on a deeper level. I think this is an important task because it'll help have more educated conversations around the topic. And as we'll talk about later, it can help some of our users better help prevent against them. The analysis, as I mentioned, we'll look at them at a deeper level, and we'll look at things about how shootings have changed over time. We'll also look at other factors in the causes of shootings, such as what the cause was itself, who the targets were, where the shootings happen, the frequency, the deadliness of them, and also the mental health of the shooters. And so the users of this project, there will be two users of the project mainly. So the first user will be any politician, a local government officer, public safety official who has some sort of interaction with gun control. The specific focus could be some sort of legislator on a gun law committee or a police officer. The second user, while relatively broad, is really the general public. This analysis applies to their public safety, and it's important that they can have an educated discussion on the topic using the facts that I've helped them discover. There'll be three tasks in this analysis. The first will be to identify the most common places for a shooting to happen. The second will be to identify who and why is the most likely target of a mass shooting. And the third will be to search for trends in both the commonality of shootings in certain locations and in general over time. So looking at our first task to identify the most common location for a shooting, we'll be focused on these two charts here. So shootings in open versus closed locations and shooting by location. And so it's very interesting, as you can see, that closed locations actually are more common, which may be a bit more difficult, interestingly, because you would have to get into the location, but it's maybe a bit more safe or a bit more likely if you were a shooter, because maybe, you think it's more harder for someone to see what's going on. Another interesting thing, if you look at the location, is actually that home shootings, we'll talk about more in a minute, are much more common more common than school shootings. And school shootings have received a lot of attention, as they should, but maybe home mass shootings should be receiving more. But we also see that a lot of other places have been victims of this, such as universities, even just out in the street, at restaurants, unfortunately. A lot have been at post offices and other government places. So very, very unfortunate to see that. But if we kind of go back to our insights here real quick. So the insight for this one will be that home shootings are 29.5% more common than school shootings. I think this is very meaningful because, it shows that home shootings are much more difficult to prevent than a school shooting. If you're at a school, you could have like resource officers and safety officers there, but not necessarily at home. But one reason I think this may be happening, which we'll talk about more in a minute, is that there's more shootings in that are targeted of family. And so because of that, I think there may be more home shootings. And kind of talking about this a bit more, I think it does show a deep understanding because by combining both open and closed locations, data, as well as a kind of the shootings locations, we can better help keep our users safe. And also, I think being able to combine both of those visually is valuable. Also, I think it's actionable because people can have better security in their homes and also think about keeping less guns in their homes. Moving on to our second task. So our second task, as I mentioned, will be to identify who and why is the most likely target of a mass shooting. So to do that, we'll be looking at the targets and causes of shootings, as well as the mental health of these shooters. And so when we look here at the count of targets, we see something very interesting, and that random shootings are much, much more common than any other type of shooting. And we see that the cause of shootings, many of them, the most common is someone is a psychopath is committing the shooting. And when we look down here at the mental health of the shooters, we can see that it's, while many are not recorded, there are more shooters who do have mental health issues than don't have mental health issues. One quick point to mention, I think is interesting, is that the fact that 124 of them were unknown is bad because we really should be keeping track of the mental health of shooters, as it's a very important thing to talk about. But when we look at sort of the causes of them, of people that do have mental health issues, we can see that many of them are psychopaths, which lines up with that. But a lot of them are actually terrorists. And so what we can see, which is kind of our insight here, is that terrorist motivated shootings are about 50% more likely here. People who do have mental health issues than those who don't. And this is important because, it's mental health is an issue that hasn't been talked about as much in the US as it should probably. And although it's becoming easier to talk about, it's still very problematic. And so if we were keeping better track of the mental health of people, especially if they perhaps had a criminal record before, we could have kept note of this and we could have helped prevent these shootings by giving them the resources they need rather than perhaps incarcerating them or taking other measures to punish them. So I thought that was very, very interesting and a valuable insight. And this can help our users, such as politicians, because they can make more effective laws around mental health. There's been a lot of talk of creating databases of criminals and their mental health records. So that's something that state legislators can do. So that's kind of our second task here. And then going down to our third and our insight there as well. So going down to our third task, so we could see that the task is to search for trends in both the commonality of shooting in certain locations and in general over time. So we'll be looking at a few charts here. So first, we'll look at shooting count by year. Something very alarming we could see is that, through the 60s, through the 70s, even through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, mass shootings were not very common. You saw at most 9 in 1 year, but most ranged below 5 or 6 in a year. While that's one too many, it's much lower than it is now. But you see in 2015, 2016, shooting spiked up rapidly to 67 and 69. And while they did drop down in 2017, and this data only goes 2017, after 2017, shootings have been even higher, and there's been dozens of them even this year through April. And so it's an alarming kind of pace that they're at, which is very unfortunate. And moving down here, we could actually look at the causes and the locations of shootings and how they've changed over time. And so one thing that's interesting here is that looking at causes of over time, you see many in the beginning were terrorism or psycho or revenge, but there's less causes here. But if you look down here and sort of in the latter years of the analysis, you see that much more things have come into play. You see things like robbery, revenge, gambling, gang activity, just someone was angry. And so you're seeing that there's not necessarily a decrease in shootings motivated by psychos or terrorism per se, like we saw up in the earlier years here, but we could see that there's more new types of shootings which are causing the issues. And so if we kind of look at the location, we see another interesting trend. Well, this is not an insight, it's an interesting trend. So we see that at the beginning, most of the locations were schools, universities, churches, places of worship or where you work or your home. And these are places where people that you may know theoretically. But as we go into latter years, you kind of see a bit more random locations come into merge. So you see places like just a killing spree, a movie theater, a shopping mall, a temple, or a spa, a restaurant. And then you see places like a military training site or in a nightclub, or at a campsite even, or a health clinic, many other places. So again, similar to the causes of shootings, you're seeing that it's not necessarily a decrease in the other types of locations, but rather an influx of new type of locations. And then here we could see the targets. And again, I think you could see a very similar trend, whereas at the beginning, many of them were more, some of them were random, but a lot of them were like students and teachers and people you may know. And then if you go into the latter years, you see more new type of places, or more new type of targets being targeted. So, Marines, that lines up military training site. You see things like just random. This is very startling that 20 of 90 of these shootings were random. And so that either means that, people, like we saw before, there's more mental health issues, and or the fact that, we're not doing a good enough job investigating our users, right? So our user legislators and police officers. So they should be doing a better job investigating these shootings, because they're not necessarily figuring out the cause. And perhaps while it's noted as random, perhaps there was something deeper that they could have uncovered. So then we could look at here, and this is kind of where our insight comes into play. So this is our homes. This shows home shootings between 2018 and 2012, and then home shootings between 2013 and excuse me, 2016. And so you can see, if you look at the sum throughout these 4 or 5 years period, excuse me, as compared to this 4 or 5 year period, you could see that the shootings have actually increased about 900% in the period at home. And this is a very, very startling sort of insight, because it means it's very relevant to our second user. And our second user, as we mentioned before, is just the general public, many of which own homes. And so with this kind of in mind, it's very actionable, I believe, for homeowners. And while they shouldn't necessarily be scared, because while there's many, it's not the most common thing to happen. But as we saw before, many of these shootings are becoming more and more family motivated. And so perhaps you want to think about keeping less guns in the house, or people can think about having stricter background checks in their states for our first user, politicians. But homeowners are second, for general public, our second user, can think about putting more effective sort of security measures into place. So that's kind of the third insight there. And then just kind of going through as a reminder, so there's many attributes in the data set. So we had the latitude and longitude of shooting, the fatalities, sort of the mental health of the shooter, which we looked at, the title of the shooting, and then the other important things we looked at, which were the target and the cause, as well as the year and date, along many different sort of methods. In terms of the marks and channels, for task 1, as we mentioned, we have these 4 charts. So shootings in open versus closed locations and shootings by locations. The marks were bar marks, and the channels were length, color, and an average line. In terms of count of targets and causes for task 2, these 4 charts, their marks were for count of targets and causes of shootings were horizontal bar marks, and then the color was a channel and the length was a channel. In terms of the marks for the mental health of shooters, we used vertical bars as a mark, and then the channels we used were color and height. For mental health by cause, we used sort of a tree, and then we used horizontal bars as well in that as marks. And then for channels, we used color, length, and then the title annotations for the categories. Excuse me. For task 3, these number of graphs we had. So for the marks for shooting count by year, we used lines, and the channels we used annotations of count by year and colors. For marks for causes of shootings over time, location of shootings over time, and targets of shootings over time, we use trees, horizontal bar marks, and the channels we use color, length, title annotations. And then for the marks for the home shootings between 2018 and 2012 versus 2013 and 2017, we use bars, and the channels we used were height. And that graph was used to help the user better see the actual insight. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And hopefully you can consider some of the recommendations here, and on your own take a deeper look into the notebook, which will be linked in the description. And you can feel free to sort of take a deeper look into some of the other things here, as there is quite a bit of data. So thank you very much, and yeah.